let's mix it up here. Let's have a real session. I'm excited about this. I'm Paul Alivisatos. I'm one of the presidents that's going to be on the panel here. Um, and in fact, if you're wondering, because we have a little table of presidents here, it was not a therapy session. We actually just had a really great discussion about some of the issues that we're all grappling with in a really wonderful way. So I'm Paul Alivisatos. I'm president of the University of Chicago, and I'm going to make a few kind of setting the table remarks, and then we're going to launch into this panel, which is, I think it's going to be really interesting and fun. I think you all know that our institution is really deeply devoted to free expression in the most powerful ways. I hope in the panel I can share some events just from today that speak to that. But there's absolutely no doubt that in society at large, we're in a state where free expression is in distress. And we also see a situation which is deeply concerning, deeply concerning, that society in many dimensions has become skeptical of universities, and that indeed, the well-known maxim, it takes decades to build trust and very little time to lose it. We're in a moment when universities are actually losing the trust that they have had, and it's a really critical moment because without that trust, it's hard to be a place of truth-seeking. It's hard to be a place that does what universities promise. They promise to be places where enormous gifts of knowledge are produced, and to be places where people learn how to engage in dialogue in order to be truth seekers. And we're in a place where that's it's really in distress and it's being questioned. It didn't happen overnight. There's been decades of these challenges, but now they're really in an acute phase. And so I think it's critical that universities strive in every way possible to be seen by a broad section of the public as trustworthy. But that you can only be trustworthy if you earn the trust, and you can only earn the trust if you have a set of core principles that animate your decision making and that you bring into practice when they are, at all times, really, but also that you bring into practice in moments of crisis, such as the ones that are going on now. So I think the topic of this panel around principles in action is the right topic for us to engage with. I will start by saying that there aren't that many principles like it's usually the case. I know one of my co-panelists at Seidel is a physicist. There's not a lot of principles that are required here to make these things work, and we can debate exactly how to think about them all. But I think that, in my mind, that there's no question that freedom of inquiry and expression sits at the core. It is the most vital principle inside a university. There are other principles at work, of course, that I believe are in conversation with and are constantly in support of that, and they're connected to it. So I think there's no doubt that the university will do better when it evinces consistently, every way it knows how, over and over and over again, a commitment to excellence in the pursuit of knowledge. And also, I believe, a recognition that in order to execute the truth-seeking function, a kind of diversity of viewpoint and a diversity of experience promotes the healthy questioning that's essential. The questioning of received wisdom, which, after all, is the biggest barrier we have to figuring stuff out. And finally, I believe that there is another piece to this, which is a university should have a pretty fierce resistance to any authority seeking to establish truth, any authority seeking to limit discussion. And now I'm talking about any authority, whether it is internal or external, whether it's governments or mobs or wealth or power. All of those things are things which can seek to act inside a university to restrict the ability of seeking truths, and universities will do well to be resistant to those things. So the last principle is, in my view, really fundamental, and that is to stand firm in the conviction that it's important, essential, in fact, in order to be a great research university, it's essential to make a point of safeguarding institutional neutrality. It's just at the core of things. And there are so many discussions going on today about that, as if this is something newly discovered, but it's really foundational, and there's no substitute for it. Authority really cannot establish truth for the entirety of an institution that is dedicated to truth seeking. It's imperative that individuals within a university seek truth without being limited by authority, whether that's authority from above, from without, or from below, uh, all of which happens, people trying to control what can be said. Um, in recent months, there have been many pressure campaigns waged on universities from every conceivable direction. And I see a great need for those who love universities to really hark on this issue of this inflection point and struggle with it so that we can improve things for all of our institutions. Our long-term health depends upon us being able to exert influence on a very public crisis to restore trust in our universities through adherence and good practice of those core principles. I will say, if a university consistently fails to correct these kinds of errors, there is a marketplace of universities too. And universities that act according to principle and in concert to correct mistakes will, over time, gain more trust. And of course, it won't take much to lose it. So we have to really work on that very hard. I will say that there is another component, which I think we'll have a chance to talk about here, which I think is a really important piece of this, and that is how is it that if universities have made a mistake, how do they find ways of correcting themselves? What are the processes for doing that, and how do they work? I think we should interrogate that because it's pretty clear that there have been mistakes, and to correct those is something that has to be struggled with. And I'm very skeptical of efforts to kind of come in and control those things. But I think it's a topic for a struggle inside of a university to have its ways for doing that are genuine and that are real. So I hope that gives a little bit of a feel for what's at stake here and how important this topic is. And so now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Tony Banout, who, thank you, had a wonderful time here at the Heterodox Academy, and then somehow we managed to snag him to become the executive director of our new University of Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. So, Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. And, I'm actually like a super lucky person because you were able to snag me at UChicago, and I still remain a very proud card-carrying board member of the Heterodox Academy. And in that capacity, yeah. If you other board members didn't know there was a card, by the way, you're missing out on some key privileges. In that capacity, I'll just say it's been unbelievable to see the growth just in numbers and in energy in the network in the last 2 years since we were together in Denver. It's inspiring. And I'm not a mathematician. I don't know if we saw 25%. Well, we were at like 4,400 in Denver or something and 7,000 now. I think it's something like that. That's an aggressive, if we could do that every 2 years, I mean, that revolutionizes higher education. And that's the path we're on, and it's exciting. I'm going to introduce, in addition to Paul, three fine higher education leaders who are going to join me in a moment to moderate the panel. Hiram Chodosh is the 5th president of Claremont McKenna College and is widely recognized for innovations and accomplishments in both higher education and institutional legal reform, with a focus on the structural improvements of emerging legal systems. Claremont McKenna has been recognized nationally for its commitments to freedom of expression, including receiving the Institutional Excellence Award from the Heterodox Academy. And under Hiram's leadership, Claremont McKenna launched the Open Academy in 2019, a renewed set of educational and institutional commitments to freedom of expression, viewpoint diversity, and constructive dialogue. Daniel Diermeier is the 9th Chancellor of Vanderbilt University and an internationally renowned political scientist and management scholar. Daniel is a first-generation college graduate who, prior to starting his tenure at Vanderbilt, served as the provost at the University of Chicago. And Daniel launched Dialogue Vanderbilt, an initiative that advances Vanderbilt's longstanding commitment to free expression, institutional neutrality, and civil discourse, while preparing students to contribute and to lead in a pluralistic global society. And last but certainly not least, President Ed Seidel is the 28th president of the University of Wyoming and a distinguished academic known internationally for scientific excellence and bold vision, dynamic and collegial leadership with a track record of advancing scientific research, technology development, and economic progress at the university, state, and national levels. Ed has leveraged that experience to develop a vision for UW's continued success. And in 2022, he began UW's initiative on freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, and constructive dialogue to enhance Wyoming's reputation as a place where all voices can be heard and all people can thrive. Ed Seidel's PhD is in relativistic astrophysics from Yale. Gentlemen, please join me on stage and let's begin. It's not been an easy year to be a university or college president. And I'm struck that each of you has actually entered that year having already done tangible things to establish the primacy of free expression, constructive engagement. What, as you look back on the year, what worked well and what did you learn? And maybe we'll begin from Daniel and work our way over back to Paul.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I was at my first Heterodox Academy meeting, oh, good Lord, six or 7 years ago, I think, when I was still provost at the University of Chicago, which was in New York. And it's just wonderful to see the growth and so many of you here. I think you mentioned already, we have been very clear about the principles that will guide our decision-making when it comes to free expression. At Vanderbilt, there is the first one we call that open forum, which is, classic kind of free expression principles, similar to what's University of Chicago had in the Stone Report, for example. The second one is our commitment to institutional neutrality. Again, given my further time at the University of Chicago, the Calvin Report, of course, is the document that has expressed that, I think, the rationale for that most clearly. And then the third thing, which is at Vanderbilt, an important part of our culture, which we call civil discourse, which is about really treating each other with respect, using arguments and reasoning. And our students, when they arrive on campus, they sign actually something that's called a community creed, which emphasizes those values, just like when they do their honor code as well. So it's an important part of who we are. These are not new principles. We've had them for decades. So they go back to the fifth chancellor at Vanderbilt, Alexander Hurt. We only had 9 chancellors on 151-year history, so people tend to stick around for a while. The key thing, I think, was for us is to clearly communicate these principles and then act accordingly. That was the most important thing. And for example, we had, like at many campuses, we had a fairly small but fairly radical group asking for a divestment, but also like boycotting of businesses that had any ties to Israel. And in line with our institutional neutrality principles, we made already clear in December that that's inconsistent with those principles. Tennessee actually has a law that makes this illegal as well. So it was kind of an interesting dimension added to that. And then when there was the attempt to push against that, we acted accordingly. I'll just add one little story, which was kind of the big thing that made national news with respect to Vanderbilt. So on May 26th, we had a small group of students, about 27 of them, break into the administrative building. The building was closed still for some minor construction. They ran over a security guard. The security guard was injured. And then they tried to get into my office, were prevented from doing so. We had them sit then in front of my office. They came at 9 a.m. until 5 a.m. There was no food, no access to bathrooms. And we arrested the 3 students that had injured the security guard, and everybody else then left. Everybody was subject to student discipline. The students had been warned that that would be the case. We had a few of the students expelled, some suspended, and some had probation. That was all done in a fairly short time period using our standard disciplinary process. Not everybody, of course, was in support of that. So we had all sorts of discussions, and happy to go into that in detail. But it was very important for us that we're clear about what the principles are. We had, for months, our students did a great job discussing, protesting. We had actually the same week when this happened. Earlier, we had the Israeli ambassador and the former prime minister of the Palestinian Authority on campus. We had a Passover Seder celebrated by 800 members of our community. So this has worked really well. Our community has done great, but we had a small group of students that tried to push the envelope, that tried to violate our principles, and then we acted accordingly with utilizing the student disciplinary process as we always would. So I think clarity on principles, communicating them, we already had talked about this for years, including when it came to institutional neutrality, and then act when there was a violation and in a manner that was consistent with our processes, but also in a manner that was decisive.
It's great. Yeah. Thanks. Hiram, please.
Well, first, thank you for having us, and thank you for having me. I'm in tremendous debt to Heterodox. 5 years ago, the Institutional Excellence Award and Jonathan Haidt gave us a tremendous amount of confidence and courage in building out a series of programs. I agree entirely with Daniel that principles, policy, self-enforcement have been critical. But just to go back a step, I remember my first year, I started an initiative that put diversity and freedom of speech together in one phrase, which I'm not sure had been done. But 6 years ago, we also had a barricaded building. And in that instance, after a 4-week judicial process, suspended 5 students. And I'm not sure other universities had suspended students for that kind of disruption before, or else they hadn't published it. And I think that action was one of the many keys in our success this year. One of the best things I did in the fall is I took a 6-month sabbatical. So I was actually in the Grand Canyon, off the grid on the Colorado River on October 7th. And one of the biggest mistakes I made was not taking a full year sabbatical. But in emphasizing not just principle and policy and enforcement, I want to talk a little bit about program. And I want to talk about program as a long-term investment in building out the deeply pedagogic strategies that we all must continually reinvest in. I think, as Paul said, you can't earn trust back very quickly, and you can't create the conditions for dialogue in a reactive moment. These are long-term investments, and our Open Academy as it stands now is a pervasive, immersive set of commitments through every pore of what we do. It goes all the way back to admissions. This is based on a conversation I had with Bob Zimmer many years ago about whether we could leverage our prestige, those of us who are in a selective spot, to make it clear to K through 12 that we care about this. I mean, parents invest over $1 billion a year in test prep. Why? Because they think we make decisions based on test scores, which actually turns out to be not entirely true. And if they thought we cared about this, they might actually invest in making sure that their kids knew how to contend, how to grapple, that they paid attention to the news, that they knew how to debate, that they had the basic communication skills of acknowledgement and neutral reframing, that They were willing to step across some dividing line in society. And so recruiting, clarity on mission, essay prompt, interview questions. I once saw an application a few years ago where a young woman joined the Republican Club. That's not astounding in and of itself. Why did she join? Because she came from a Democratic family. She's in. I don't even need to see the rest of her application. She's in. And that's the kind of thing that I think we all have to pay attention to. So everyone has the same, dialogue training on entry, 4-day wilderness trip. Every guide is trained in dialogue. Every RA is trained in dialogue. Every student leader is trained in dialogue. We have our Athenaeum program, 4 nights a week, roundtable discussions. We flip for controversial topics, salons of intimate gatherings. We have students, our CARE fellows, our Open Academy fellows, our Model UN team, our debate union, all as peer trainers and coaches, our Romero success coaches, all doing dialogue training on things like self-censorship and other important topics to everyone here. So I think when I came back, of course, me being away, think about there being no president and against our nonpartisanship policy and the board's endorsement of Calvin and all of the programming that we have, even when our students are upset about something happening in the world or on one of the other campuses, they show up to talk, listen, and learn. But that did not happen just because we snapped some rabbits out of a hat. It happened from our long-term commitment.
Thanks. So I would say what went well last year primarily was that we already had a head of steam on this freedom of expression on campus. We were in the midst of finalizing what was put in place about a year before. And thanks to Martha McCoy, some of you will know, we really had a terrific activity that led to a set of principles, of course, based in part on the Chicago principles. And in fact, I'd had a bit of, I'm not in any way a legal expert, but I had been at the University of Illinois before moving to Wyoming, and I had worked there on freedom of expression principles, so I already was very familiar with the Chicago principle. So I kind of brought this with me to Wyoming, and I thought a lot about it. I was very concerned about the increasing polarization, and also as a backdrop, I'm sure you all recognize Wyoming is a very, very conservative state, I would say, and proudly so, very proudly conservative, very rural. It's the size of the United Kingdom, and it has 500,000 people. And so just get a sense of how incredibly rural it is. And so when you have students coming from very small towns to a place like the liberal city of Laramie, Wyoming, of 30,000 people, it can be quite a shock for them, actually. And one of the legislators about a year before last year, so a couple years ago, had said to me something like, you're so much a liberal place, you brainwash our kids. So we take our ranch kids, we send them down to liberal Laramie, and they come back wanting to eat tofu. And that's literally a comment that I had from someone about it. So anyway, that's the backdrop. We're also 50% funded by the state. And we're the only university in the state. So it really, really matters to people what goes on. And so we're under a microscope all the time. So last year, when we did adopt the principles, I should say a word about what it took for us to do this. We had a committee that started up about 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago. But I was provoked once in a public setting by someone who asked me if I believed in freedom of speech on campus. And I said, well, of course. And I cited the Chicago principles, which did gain me some credibility. Thank you very much for that. And obviously the person who's actually, I'll name her, Karen Kemmer. She's very, very become a very good friend. She really wanted to ensure that we were taking this very seriously. So I asked her, why don't you join me and we'll start an activity freedom of expression on campus, and then Martha took on the leadership of it. So anyway, we came out with the same kinds of principles that you're all celebrating here: neutrality and freedom of expression, and the host of things that are very important for all of us. And so rather than just adopting them, we decided everyone has to own them. And this happened during the last year. We said, okay, we're not just going to say the president approves this report. We'll get it approved by the faculty senate, the staff senate, the student senate, the deans, the cabinet, the directors of institutes. And individually, they all took it on. We kind of crossed our fingers, and it went through, and they approved them. And so then we have a deep sense of what they're about. But then the last year in particular was, what do we do next? Because I'd asked not only that we develop principles, but that we operationalize them. And I mean that very deeply. Everything from what do we do with our policies? Do they really conform to what our statement says? What about how do we communicate them? What do we actually do on campus? How do we actually live them? And so that work has been going on for nearly 18 months. And I think it will go on forever if we do this well, because it's just something that's got to be brought in really deeply to what we do every single day on the campus. So anyway, that went very well. And then in the last year, when there's been a lot of attack on the university, we were among the states that decided that DEI was no longer something that should be supported by state funds, and that was very clear. With this appropriation, we could not operate the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, but we had these principles to say, wait a minute, we're not what you're thinking. We have these principles, and we are actually working every day on making sure all voices are heard, all voices are not only allowed, but cultivated. And when I talk about neutrality, I add the word active in front of it, active neutrality. So we're cultivating that neutrality. And that is, I think, taking some time, but it is really beginning to blunt some of the criticism of the university. And I think that will, in time, do us a lot of good going forward.
Things.
For sure.
I want to build on the comments, all really excellent ones, and maybe make a bit of a comment about two components of this. One is presidents and one is culture. So on the president's side, I mean, I'm deeply privileged to be in this lineage. And if we go, all the way back to William Rainey Harper, one of his earliest speeches to the faculty was free expression at the university. And if you read that, you'll see that everything that we just said was in there. And there's been this sequence, this legacy of presidents who at each stage spoke to these topics and championed them and acted on them. So I think that's vital. And so, of course, this year, as others have recounted, there have been moments where obviously these principles had to be called into action. And so for me, I took the perspective that I would be extremely transparent and put out a set of statements along the way during the situation where we had an encampment at the beginning, stating, trying to frame that discussion, that we will, we're a place where we're going to lean into free expression. Maybe there are some violations of time, place, and manner, but within certain constraints, that might go on for a little while, but we'll observe. And then that if that's disruptive, if that's denying the rights of others, if that's monopolizing spaces in ways that are not right, and so on, we will ultimately end it. So we did that. And so at each stage of the way, I made sure that I was going back to the core principles and explaining to any person who wishes to question my decisions that they would know the basis on which I had made them, and they could do that. So that's how I approached it. At the same time, last year, we did a lot of work prospectively to talk about the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression to strengthen the culture. And I do want to go back to a historic moment. You referred, a couple of times people have referred to the Calvin Report. I want to remind that the Calvin Report was commissioned by President Beadle, but it was actually 7 faculty who engaged in a dialogue with their colleagues and also with the administration and produced that report, which today is so widely admired. I want to emphasize the extent to which that was produced through the community of scholars that is the University of Chicago, that was something that the community itself developed. And my sense has been that on our campus, there is a general acceptance of these ideas, but their actual practice is a great struggle. So there's a couple of things I'll just mention as like very recent things. The day after, I acted to end the encampment because it was so disruptive and it was really violating all kinds of our principles, and it needed to be ended in that way. The forum held an event, and it was, basically, did Alivisatos get this right or not? It was come and debate the encampment, and it was attended by, very large number of faculty. How many? 200,
north of 200.
North of 200 faculty came to that the next day, and they had this dialogue. And they afterwards, for whatever such surveys are worth, almost to a person, they reported understanding the point of view of the other person that had been, on the campus at the same time, but perhaps perceiving these things differently. So I think that we need more of those kinds of situations. The other thing I'm happy to report is that today we had our Council of the Senate. So we have a faculty senate. There are 50 members who represent it. There's a smaller committee that we meet with regularly, but there's the council itself. And the council wished to engage in a dialogue with us about these events. And so we had a thoughtful, serious meeting in which different points of view were expressed, in which there were many ideas presented for ways in which we can become a better practicing organization of free expression. And I thought that it was an example of a culture that struggles to do this, that accepts that it's not always easy, but that is committed to doing that on a constant basis. And so, I think these different pieces have to reinforce each other. You need the leadership to take these positions and to be very clear about them. But you also need to talk about what is it and I think that's what you were all describing, is what are the elements of creating the culture that is the one that's actually going to carry this, and to be willing to say at any given moment, let's dig in again. Let's reflect on how we just did and try to see if our practices held up to the principles that we agree to. And so I think that's a key piece to this.
So one of the ways of understanding a tradition that, my faculty colleague, Tom Ginsberg, the faculty director of the Forum on Free and Creative Expression, who I think is here, took inspiration from when we put together a compilation of UChicago's history of free inquiry and expression that we called the Chicago Canon. This notion of a tradition is a living conversation over generations and a struggle to understand the goods that constitute it. Alistair McIntyre has philosophical language for this, a socially embedded, historically extended argument about the goods that constitute it. And the language of struggle, or the clarity in communicating principles and then enforcement, and then the recursive moments in which we're seeking to learn and move forward in a stronger, more productive way, to me are emblematic of a living tradition. So I wonder, my second question for the round would be as you've lived into that in your own contexts, what, if I could put it this way, what failed, or what do you look at that was that I might not have gotten that right, or we might not have gotten that right, and I've got to do this differently. We have to do this differently moving forward. We'll go in the same order, Daniel, if I can call on you.
I love the historical perspective, and there were a bunch of things, I would call them implementation, operational stuff and we have this internal commitment to kind of continuous improvement. So whenever we have anything significant, we look back. It's like we'll watch film on Monday. We see how do we do better, and there were a variety of things like that. So, how do we communicate? How do we communicate a media access policy? We didn't have a camping policy, for example, right? We had a very, very small encampment, 10 tents or something like that. So it wasn't It wasn't a big issue for us. How do we deal with people that come from the outside, that are members of the community? I mean, variety of things that usually have not been an issue for us. And I think just going through this experience, see like, oh, we got to think about this. So that's one piece. I think the thing that I found surprising, and it goes back, I think I love the way, you described this as like educational principles, right? Is that I think there were various aspects where I think I'm going to call the reasons for having these principles were not clear to people. And I'll just give you one example. I think there's basically ignorance. Maybe it's willful ignorance, I don't know, about like civil disobedience. Okay, so people now call this disruption, but put themselves in a lineage with the members of the civil rights movement. And I mean, we had in this particular case students injuring a member of the community. Well, that's not what the lunch counter sit-ins did. Okay. And that's not what Martin Luther King did, and that's not what James Lawson, who was a Vanderbilt graduate, they were, I think as Martin Luther King said, joyfully and intentional violating a rule in order to demonstrate the injustice of that, and violating, and then taking the consequences and the abuse and the beating, gave their position additional moral gravitas. It was just the opposite. And this kind of lack of historical understanding and context, where I would say worries me. I don't think there's anything specific to Vanderbilt, but you see there's a whole variety of other universities, that the clarity of principle, what is protest, why is it that we do like time, place, manner restrictions, which we can do on private universities, different conversation of call ed in your world. Why do we do that? What's the reason for that? What's the difference between protest? What's between protest and civil disobedience? And how do these things fit together? It worries me. It worries me that we're not clear about that. And I think that's just, certainly we look at that and ask ourselves, we just have to do better on that and have more discussions and more clarity on that.
Yeah.
I want to go back before going forward just a step, because when we talk about policy, principle policy enforcement, and we talk about freedom of expression in a free speech paradigm, we often fall into a bit of a trap. And that trap is we conceive of that in a vertical way. And by vertical, I mean Congress shall make no law. We're talking about a state-society relationship. In the university context, we're talking about a president or institution against the community. And we do that in that vertical way. It makes complete sense. But the problem with that, folks, is it's not an educational model. It's in a very important bedrock relationship. And I think in part what Daniel and I are getting at right now is how can we be more pedagogic in our approach to these questions? It's not just about whether as president I can respond to a crisis according to principle and policy and enforce it well and have my community understand what I'm doing and why and how this fits within a certain set of university and national value traditions. But it's also about the horizontal problem of free expression or freedom of speech. And by horizontal, I mean that one of the challenges I started to see several years ago was that people started to say, you're violating my freedom of speech because you're intimidating me with your speech. And that's a big problem with freedom, folks, because we have to adjudicate when one's freedom is infringing on another's. That's why, Paul, you said, okay, we err on the side of encampment. It's expressive, it's disruptive, yes, but as soon as it starts to cross that line and interrupt, yes, the university's functioning, but really we're talking about learning. We're talking about what we're there to do. Once it interrupts that, we have to intervene. But before we get to intervention, we have to talk pedagogy. We have to talk about how, as educators, not as administrators, how as educators, we reinforce these values peer to peer, horizontally, not just state society, not just president to faculty to student.
Yes.
And I fear, and this is sort of my big macro observation, that this year, higher ed leadership and those observing it were cast into a security game and a politics game, and we've lost the game that we're supposed to play well, and that's a pedagogy game or a learning. We're not very good, folks, at security. I mean, none of us were trained in security. Some of us have learned a lot on the job, but it's not our profession. Look at the presidents who are trained in that. The president of the Ohio State University, awesome at it, just awesome. But there are very few of us who are that good. We're not professional politicians. A couple of us are, and they're very good at it. Most of us here are not professional politicians. And it's one of the reasons that I think the congressional testimony was such a disaster. One of the reasons is that our peers were in a political forum and were, to some extent, responding as if they were in a court or maybe back home, but I'm not so sure. And we have to get back to our game. And we have to use our game, the ability to ask really provocative, reflective, reverse projection questions back to our interrogators. Where were you? What was your position during Charlottesville 2020 and so forth? And I think that's a shared challenge, maybe even a shared failure on our part that is understandable because we're reacting to the moment, we're reacting to the crisis, but we have to use our temperament and our belief in the human capacity to learn and transcend to get back to what we do best.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think I want to say a little bit about some of the challenges, and then also an example where I think we could have responded in a different way. And as we're saying, we're all learning on the job. Actually, some may be legal scholars, but even being a legal scholar, it's not always easy. You see, I've been reading a lot of books on this over the last year. You see cases where one judge rules another way, it's overturned, and it's overturned again, and so on. So these things have a lot of subtlety in them. But anyway, the amount of work that we have to do to really have more than a set of principles that sit on a shelf, but actually live by them is extraordinary. And I've just been struck by it. So, for example, people do not like that there can be hate speech. And in fact, there are, so we're now going through all of our regulations to make sure, do we actually, in our own regulations, do we have problems in what the nice intents might be to have civil discourse, but you can't go too far in that. You really have to allow things to be said that are uncomfortable, that really make people angry sometimes. It's what happens. It's what you want to do if you really have true freedom of expression and then have people learn. So I've had a lot of criticism by some of my own faculty. In fact, I had one statement anonymously who said, Seidel has had a lot of terrible ideas, but this freedom of expression is the worst. And if that's the worst thing I've done on campus, I'm pretty pleased, actually. but it just goes to show somehow how deep people's feelings are about these things. And so the principles have got to really be taken in and then have to be understood in the context of what we actually do on campus. So that's just one example. So we will just continue to do all of that work. I have a couple of examples of things we might have done differently. And one of them I'll say was, some of you, if you're following the news, you may know we have a trans student in a sorority. About a year and a half ago, as we were already started on this freedom of expression activity, but it wasn't fully baked yet. We did have an incident where someone misgendered this student at a table that they were provided in the student union, where the student actually worked, and so it was an issue that we thought a lot about. We had to make an instant decision. So our decision ultimately was to ban this person from tabling in the union for a year. Now, that wasn't saying that they couldn't go outside the building or in Prexy's pasture, which is a nice little, the quad basically, and say the same things. But we thought that was a privilege, and it violated our policies on student harassment. So, long story short, this is challenged in courts, and the judge came back and said that we, as a university, had violated this person's First Amendment rights. So here I am talking about freedom of expression, and I've actually been challenged for actually violating someone's First Amendment rights. And so I very much respected the ruling. We were disappointed in the way it played out because we're trying to support our students and protect our students. So there's clearly a gray area in there. But I think I've definitely learned about how we want to make sure that our policies are actually written so that we can make the right kinds of decisions that are backed by our principles. And just one example where I think I've learned something in there. At the same time, I do think it's a gray area, but we're going to think very carefully how we word our regulations going forward.
Yeah, I'll just note quickly, if I may, and I think Hiram hinted at this a moment ago, like you're navigating at something different by running a large public campus in which the First Amendment actually does govern decisions you make and don't make.
That's
and I think this particular incident is a fine example of how that the rubber meets the road.
Exactly.
Like that.
Right. Maybe. Well, I'll hold. I have other comments for later. But just on the public institution, of course, we have public money that's very, very highly scrutinized by our legislature, and we have to be very thoughtful about it. So, without overdoing it, we, in some cases, will use private money to support activities that we think are important for the campus that maybe part of the state is thinking, okay, I'm not sure I agree with that, but they will respect the idea that we're using private money.
Yeah. And just not to put too fine a point on it, I think everybody in this room probably understands this, but on the private campuses, it's not technically the First Amendment that is governing these issues, even though that sometimes is where campuses might take some direction or inspiration. There's private regulations. Do you want to chime in on that?
I really want to thank Hiram for bringing in that perspective, because I think it's really spot on. This issue of how will students have a peer culture in which they don't just accept free expression, but they actually come to see it as being the fulcrum of their education, the vital point at which, because of it, they may actually have a moment in which it really changes them because they've heard something that they have to now struggle with. They thought they knew something, and then it kind of turns around for them, or even just to develop their skills. As we were saying at lunch a little bit with me here, they develop their skills to be in that kind of dialogue, and that they feel that as a sort of strengthening of themselves as citizens and as human beings. I think that's really very core. And again, I think that that's something which is an attribute of a healthy culture. And that healthy culture takes a lot of cultivating. And I know in my case, I've been at great pains in every occasion to try to use the language of gifts and responsibilities, in the sense that the process of in the way knowledge is created is by sharing ideas with an openness, but listening to ideas with an openness too, and learning to be involved in that and thinking of that as a gift we give each other, not as something that's an imposition of my view on you, that's a dialogue around that is the key to becoming somebody who can find truth. And I think for our generation of students, that's a real struggle for a lot of reasons. And so, we did ultimately, that was one of the goals I felt that we needed, even in a university that's had this long tradition. I still felt we needed this forum to be a place where lots of people, students and faculty, administrators, can come together and just really work on this problem, because right now there's a lot of challenge to this. And I think our moment stands out. It's not unique in all of history, but maybe have only been a few in the history of our university, a few moments that had this level of acuteness to them. So it's a real dialogue. You asked the question, I'm just going to give a technical process answer, forgive me, but they matter sometimes. was there something that we kind of wish we had a do-over on? And I'll just say that there's this, and it's a very specific thing, but these things actually do end up mattering. We have a process by which if there are claims by somebody that for example, their free expression has been abrogated by a protest or those kinds of things, that those can be brought forward and discussed. And there's a process by which those things unfold. And it so happens that the policy that we have prescribes a certain sequence of events, but the actual practice for more than a decade didn't really exactly match that policy. So now it comes at a moment when everything is very acute, and you see people saying, well, look, here's the administration not following its policy exactly. And, that's because, it was, I think, we would categorize it as a kind of harmless, inconsistency with process, not a harmful one. But you learn that when you do have these situations where there's, where there are one group has violated the free expression rights of another, and those have to be brought forward. They have to be considered. There has to potentially be discipline depending on the circumstances. If you don't do that right, down to the tiniest detail, you create a situation where it isn't accepted. And so, we've got some do-overs to do that we're going to go back and just be very careful on these things to make sure that not only what we've done most recently, that it's just in accord, but that, it's literally what has been viewed as the right way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I guess
Ed wants to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ed.
One thing I think that responds well to that is I've been encouraging our campus in every way to really look yourself in the mirror. And not just yourself, but your campus. Look at what you're doing, look at your process, look at your regulations, and constantly be questioning. And if part of the whole idea of a university is to challenge ourselves and make sure that we continue to improve going forward.
The constant recursive process.
Right.
Tony, just one quick point is that I think another dynamic that you see this year playing out, and it relates to internal processes, a lot of our peers are having trouble enforcing their own disciplinary process. And University of Chicago has a faculty disciplinary process. A lot of schools have turned that disciplinary process over to students. And you can predict that, sometimes peer review is excessively harsh, and sometimes, or more often, it's excessively permissive, that if you have a serious violation of policy and it's students deciding whether to suspend or expel, that you're going to see very few suspensions or expulsions. And this is really important because if universities and colleges can't self-enforce, and it's just what you were saying last night, John, is others will come in, here the state, to enforce for them. University of Chicago, you have your own sworn police force. I think it's the largest police force in Illinois, right?
Outside the city of Chicago.
Outside the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
And, most of us don't have that. We have, just a bunch of campus safety officers, and they don't have authority or arrest authority. And so building a capacity for self-enforcement becomes vital to avoiding the dynamic of having the state come in. And we all see the costs of the necessity to do that in these extreme crises, because it does further break down the social trust and the psychological security that a lot of people in the community have, especially when things go a bit wrong at those events.
Yeah.
Can I add? I want to just add one comment to what was just said. So I think this is one problem is that you have principles and then they're not being enforced. The other problem, and of course these two things can reinforce each other, is your principles are muddy. They're not clear. Yeah. And I think we're on the stage here, and I think maybe that's why we're invited. I don't know, but we've been very vocal and very clear about some of these principles. And I'll just pick one. Paul mentioned it earlier, which is this institutional neutrality piece, right? And And the University of Chicago has always interpreted that way. We have always interpreted that way. Is that means that our endowment should not be subject to taking political positions, right? Divestment for political purposes. And there's we're like 4 or 5 universities that have that clarity, and the rest don't. And you look at some of the policies there, and they have something like this, right? There's university, the endowment should not be used to this unless in very egregious cases. And of course, you're going to drive a truck through that, right? And of course, you've done it then, a couple of times. And now, what do you do in this particular case? So, absolutely could not agree more. And it's really both things. Have clear principles and then have the courage to live by them. And also, on the way you interpret that and influence that, you're going to learn. You're going to find gaps and stuff and that's just the way the world works, and that's okay. But I think the lack of clarity of some of these principles, I think, is worrisome. I mean, I'm very happy that Harvard is now moving into the direction of institutional neutrality. They don't call it that. God knows why. But, it's something. Some semantics there that's fine. But they're not talking about divestment, which is the very core of the conflict right now, which, of course, is what the student by the pro-Palestinian activists are asking for, and at the core of the BDS movement. So that type of thing is not, I think, I don't want to beat up Harvard. I'm very happy that they're moving in that direction. But now what about this? And there's there's a whole gallery of universities that don't have that.
Yeah, right? I want to jump in.
Well, I do. I mean, I think I agree with you completely about everything you just said. But I do want to also just push on this topic of institutional neutrality, which really is, I think, it's so central. And it's possible, of course, to have a nominal institutional neutrality policy, but to have exceptions and say, for this or that reason, you can go ahead and make statements. I think there's justification under extremely limited circumstances that maybe such a thing could happen. But I think it's very important to remember that even one statement alters the pattern or the discussion it can be for decades, actually. Yeah. Even just one statement can alter the discussion for decades and creates pressures that are just unimaginable to continue to make statements because, okay, you did it over here. How could you not do it? Are you really saying you value this more than you value? And then you can see that what happens is when even the smallest exceptions are made, pretty soon there's this cascading. And I think we all know that as a consequence of that, it profoundly limits the range of opinion that is able to be exerted on the campus. And so I think this issue is, as we think about the higher education landscape and the fact that there are these movements in this direction, it's going to be really important to really dig in and really do it, and not just assert that it's being done, because they're not the same thing at all.
So we have about a half hour left, and I'm going to suggest we open it up to the floor for Q&A and discussion shortly. I have one more thing to say, because I think the institutional neutrality thing is just, it's so topical, hot, relevant right now. And I just want to actually make explicit something you said in your opening comments that actually kind of shifted a frame in my head around it, which you connected it directly to orthodoxy. You said nobody gets to set the truth.
That's right.
No authority, whether from below or above,
right,
gets to set the truth.
A mob can't prevent other people. And neither can somebody else come in and just say, this is the answer.
And here we are at the Heterodox Academy, and I heard that and thought, well, Paul's talking about orthodoxy. No. And so that statement to me connected neutrality to orthodoxy and heterodoxy, which I think is important. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the point, is that in a you can think of So I was actually raised in an Orthodox religious tradition. The word carries some weight in that sense because it's like right teaching.
It's the
It's a
correct
Christian
views.
Orthodox.
It's
It's a correct view. And in that case, it's like scripturally mandated, clerically authorized. That it has its certain role and rectitude within that realm. But the point I want to make is when you think about heterodoxy vis-a-vis those conceptions of orthodoxy, heterodoxy becomes blasphemy, apostasy, those kinds of things. If you look at the definition, you find those kinds of things. But another way to understand it, just etymologically, looking at the Greek roots, is many, heteronormativity, heterogeneity, etc. And that's really what we're after, is a diversity of views in which no one is defining the orthodox truth, the right set of views. That core, that heart of why this exists, I think you said this too, goes back for Chicago to like 1899, not 1967 in Calgary. And so it's really relevant for me to think about how those dynamics play out in successive contemporary challenges and manifestations, like Daniel, the contemporary demands of BDS, which are particular to this age, this conflict, this region. But we can think about them in these very rich ways, right?
I wanted to just add one note here that we don't speak of nearly enough. And that is, let's just take the interfaith environment. So a lot of my colleagues, want to do interfaith programming, very important. I'm all in. A lot of colleagues are dealing with faith communities where there's tremendous disagreement within those communities on politics. There's no monolith there. But the one thing that's really important to me that I learned several years ago, I think it was summer of 2014, in one of the last big Gaza-Israeli conflicts, is the intrapersonal conflict that our students were experiencing, where they were really trying to work out themselves where they stood in this crazy world of parent views, uncles' views, the news, what their faculty were saying, and really didn't know where they stood. And I think trying to hold competing truths in their minds at the same time. And I want to make sure as educators, again, that we're really focused on nurturing that. Because within these orthodoxies, there is a tremendous amount of repression, peer-to-peer or hierarchical, that any thoughtful individual must struggle with. And we can't put each and every one of us in some sort of prescribed box without opening up the heterodoxy that lives within each of us, not just in our institutional set. And that's one of the compounding reasons why heterodoxy as a concept is so important, is to give us each the freedom to express those self-contradictory, those paradoxical views. Here I am in this conference, and I don't like the phrase constructive disagreement. So I'm being heterodox by taking issue with that orthodoxy within the Heterodox Academy.
All the more power to you.
Because I wasn't put on the earth to disagree better, folks.
Yeah.
And I think that's short of where we should be. But that's just an example of me embracing heterodoxy, but still having issues with one version of how it's expressed.
Because you're calling out the importance of the personal struggle to know that is which happens within a community in dialogue with others. You're calling out that part of it, which I think is, it's at the heart of the dream of what a university should be. It's the place where people are learning and struggling to know things in dialogue with others. And I think you're right. That means that we each have uncertainty, and we're trying to not be afraid to talk about that as well as talking about the thing. Yeah, I think it's a great point.
Yeah. Apologies for the false start earlier. There were like 30 hands that went up. So let's open it. Emna was the first hand I saw, actually. Thank you, Nicole.
I just want to first say thank you. It's rare to see presidents that can hold the line and who are such strong believers in these principles and enforce them. I wish there were more of you. So if you can clone yourselves, that'd be great.
Working on it.
But I want to kind of go back to something you said, Paul, which was about the mistakes that we have made and course correction. And how do we do that? And how do institutions do that? My mind, we have included a value on campus, which in the way that it's articulated is in conflict with what we're trying to do, which is the value of inclusion. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-inclusion, but I'm saying that the ways we've talked about it on campuses has been extremely detrimental to the mission of higher education.
Yes.
And that is something that the right has latched on to and is become the source of these problems. My first question is, what can presidents do to signal that they recognize that as a mistake and change the conversation on campus?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think there's, and we've seen recently, and you gave a perfectly good example, which came from above, essentially, right? Legislature telling you how it's going to work. I think it's much better if a university community reaches that conclusion on its own. And so I think that, for example, on let's say that there's a set of policies related to diversity that have just gone off. They had maybe a good intention, but they went someplace bad. I think a university needs to be willing to struggle with that. And the struggle with it is, in fact, to do something like what Calvin was and go back and really have, really get into it and have that dialogue and not be afraid to do it. And I mean, that is the being a self-correcting community. It's a hard thing to do. But if you really want to have a place that's truth-seeking, you have to try and do that. You have to actually do it. And so that's, I guess, my answer is that I think this is something where if we're hoping that there's some external force that's going to come in and impose all of this stuff, I think we've lost the game. I mean, this has to come from the open, candid dialogue around, is this policy working? Is it actually, are we seeing compelled speech? Who wants compelled speech? I mean, really? If we can't have that dialogue, then we can't fix things. And obviously, there's all kinds of stuff. Different institutions have different policies. They do things in different ways. But if any of those institutions is unwilling to have that, and there's somebody who just says, well, this is the only way that it can be, you're in a lot of trouble at that point.
But my second question is about the anti-Semitism definition that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is, that definition, and the idea that that's going to somehow become law undermines the very principles that institutions stand for. So this would be a time that I think the Calvin report would say that institutions can make a statement. And is there any thought being given to coming out before any kind of legislation comes and saying these are antithetical to the mission of what we do? Is that something that you as presidents are thinking about?
I can speak to that. So we had right before the holidays, I got like 2 letters. One from a kind of pro-Palestinian alumni group, one from a kind of pro-Israeli group, and one of them wanted to have us to denounce Israel as being guilty of genocide and divest. The other one wanted us to adopt the IJRA definition. And we basically said, both of them are inconsistent with institutional neutrality. And, I talked about that. I spoke about it publicly. And when you talk to your faculty, of course, right, we have this is like the biggest irony of them all, right? But we've had a very successful class that our faculty started 2 years ago on the history of anti-Semitism. Very successful, really worked well during the fall. They were very tough conversation with very good, faculty member did a phenomenal job. And then he told me, well, if we're adopting that policy, well, what's the class about? Reading that policy and we're done? And I mean, there are people that study the concept of anti-Semitism and the history. That's their scholarship. And in a class like that, that's what we're exploring. So I find this very problematic. And then there's a whole other question of what do you do with incidents and so forth. That's the kind of the policy point. That's not the educational and the academic part. But I think that's very problematic. And I think the way you described it is just spot on.
There are many more hands, but if somebody wants to jump in on this, please, Ed.
I just would jump in. I'm going to go back to the first question about DEI. It's true that the legislature told us that we couldn't spend public funds on the Office of DEI. While that was going on, in fact, in the run-up to that, we were actually having quite intense discussions about whether we should make some changes. And we got to the point where we felt that if we did it like right before the legislature was going to pass some law, then it wouldn't seem genuine. So we sort of took the opportunity. They didn't define what DEI was. So we said, okay, well, here's what we think it is, at least as we think it was intended. And then we are now going through, having just gone through the freedom of expression activity, where we're going through every single regulation in the university to make sure it conforms with true freedom of expression principles that we just adopted. Now we are looking ourselves in the mirror on all DEI activities as well. So it's actually helped us quite a bit. And so we're going through that entire process kind of in parallel now, looking at everything that we do there to make sure that it's actually practiced in a way that accomplishes the goals that we really want.
Again, just to reinforce,
you got us all going.
To reinforce my thesis, these words themselves become political signals. And so then if we opine on the political signal, someone sends me a new definition of anti-Semitism. I say, I'm not that smart. I probably would have trouble with any definition. I'd want to ask lots of questions about it. What does it mean? How's it going to be interpreted? What difference will it make? That's why we have jurisprudence. And so that's one answer, but I usually collapse just into the law. I mean, we have jurisprudence on these issues. What's discriminatory? What's not? What's harassment? What's not? I can't replace my judgment with that of jurisprudence, but the answer is really what Paul's getting at, and also what everyone here is committed to, which is let's have a discussion on our campus. What do you mean by inclusion? I mean, we all struggle at Thanksgiving with who gets invited to the table. Like, do we invite Uncle Harry, who's kind of a political kook? And if we invite him, do we shut down discussion on politics? Both non-inclusive, right? If we exclude Harry or if we invite him and then we're not speaking freely, violated all the principles we're talking about here. So let's have that discussion.
And I think just to add one more piece to this, which is probably unwise to do, but I think part of the context of this is the sense that, and I think probably pretty good data to support it, that by and large, universities. Diversity of viewpoint is not where it probably ought to be. And so that creates an environment where the sense is then there's built-in biases all over the place. And in that context, all of the things of how to behave as an institution culturally and through leadership and so on become magnified 1,000 times, because if you have to really go the extra mile to make sure that all different voices are being heard. And so, it's not been a part of our discussion here, but I think it is I think we should also, as a, universities, be willing to discuss the issue of, is there a diversity of viewpoint on campuses or not? And there are many answers to that. Some of them relate to the fact that actually the diversity of experience that's been increased, people coming from many different backgrounds, has added a lot of voices to the campus that, maybe hadn't been there, and their absence was really biasing dialogue in ways that were not good. There are other kinds of biases, political bias, all kinds that are going on. And I think we'll be resistant to these issues of saying, well, we're going to come in and tell you what definitions you should be using if we actually have achieved both free expression and some real genuine diversity in the full, good, powerful sense of people from different experiences and different viewpoints being there. And that's a struggle. Universities are struggling. There's been a long period where this has been evolving. And so I think we need to be willing to talk about that on the campus.
Yeah, let's get to some more questions. There are many. Let's see. Can't actually see the micro notes. I just see many hands. Okay.
Hi. This question is for Ed of Wyoming, but I'd be curious what anyone else has to say about it. I was very surprised to hear that a student who used sex-based language, sex-based pronouns, was kicked out of the dining hall for a year, if that's how I understand it. And I was wondering how you came to that conclusion that that was the appropriate response, and then what you learned from the overturn of that decision and the overturning of it. And in general, since you have this, I'm going to use some sex-based language, so just prepare yourself. This male person identifying as a woman, wanting to be part of the sorority, and how you balance the needs of this small minority with a unique belief system versus the needs of the females in the sorority. And I'd love to hear from any of you about that, but specifically about the situation in Wyoming.
Was that addressed to Wyoming? Okay. Yes.
That came to you.
No, I'm happy to, more or less happy to answer that. I'll just say that to be a little bit more clear about what exactly happened, someone from outside the university applied for privileges to have a table in the union and to talk about his freedom of expression, what he had intended, what he thought was good, and as a very religious person, and then misgendered this student who had been, it was under, frankly, a lot of stress in the national limelight for joining a sorority. The sorority sisters, by the way, voted to accept this student as a sister. And so we accept that, and that's their decision. And this is very controversial for some people. And so when we looked at our regulations, and it was a repeated kind of offense, it wasn't the first time, we thought that according to one of our regulations about harassing students, that a possible penalty for this could be that the person could lose tabling privileges. And so we judged, and we did a deep legal analysis of this, that it did cross that line. And so we made that choice. Now, we were very clear that the person who was then banned for 1 year from tabling at the union could speak elsewhere. It was the privilege of having a table in the student union that we withdrew, and for a limited period of time. So that's the secret. That's what happened there.
Yeah, if I may ask like a further clarifying question. The policy pertained to outside folks who outside the university.
I'm not entirely sure if it was only for outside.
But this is exactly what happens when you're a public university. You have to navigate these things and have an outside person petition to use a technically state-owned space.
That's right.
They have a right to access to.
That's right. And so anyway, in our view, we were still allowing that person to express their views, but not to have that privilege because of harassing a student. That was the rationale for it. So you can judge, and a judge did judge that we had gone too far in that, and so we accepted that. And as I said, I not only respect that, but I certainly appreciate the freedom of expression in the First Amendment, and so therefore we simply accepted that and didn't challenge it. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I was trying to explain exactly what had happened.
I just see hands. So I know John Haidt's got his hand up here. I see Dorian.
Well, to echo Amna, thanks to you all. I've been in this game since 2015 when Greg and I wrote The Colony of the American Mind, and then the universities seemed to blow up and melt down right after that. And for several years...
No cause and effect, though.
So for several years after that, we kept hearing, where are the adults in the room? Why don't any of these presidents stand up? Why is it that they allow students to shout down speakers? And as far as I know, Hiram, I agree that I was tracking this, and you were the first ones who actually imposed some real consequences. At Middlebury, they imposed fake consequences, but you actually imposed some consequences for shouting people down. So my question is, as a social psychologist, I know that if almost all the presidents were acting the same way, then we can't say, oh, college presidents are weak-willed and it's their fault. Can you help us? I mean, you guys are the adults in the room, and this is just wonderful to see, and I hope the whole country will see this. Can you help us understand what it's like to be in the hot seat? Why is it that most presidents did nothing in the face of really terrible and intimidating behavior for years and years?
Maybe I'll start, and then everybody can jump in. I think what's unusual, I think, about this moment, and good to see you again, by the way. I'm just like, no, I'm seeing you sitting there. Is that you have an issue where you have two sides that feel very passionately about that. And I think what that does, it brings, some of these issues in kind of much starker relief than we typically have it, including your point that there's a kind of horizontal nature to this, an educational nature that is hugely important, and a cultural aspect to that. The reality is that, when on most issues, there's one group that cares very strongly, and nobody else is on the other side. That is 90% of the time the case. And so now, as the president, hopefully supported by your board, my board is awesome. And, part of, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but what we were able to do was in part because we had long discussions with the board about it, and everybody was aligned. But the reality is that you're going to be attacked. You're going to be called names. People may do all sorts of things in order to put pressure on you to change your mind, to flip. And it's hard, because there's nobody on the other side stepping up and supporting you. Your board may be, but it's not really the board to become public about that anyway. They'll do it, in private to support you. That's the problem. And the problem then is that you're all in your own. Nobody wants to get involved. You have to take the heat, and you do this 20 times, and it's hard. And so I think part of this is like a little like an encouragement. You got to support your presidents too. It's not only about criticizing them, right? And it's like there's a sense of like, and I cannot tell you how often when I was provost and I was president, I'll do these things that are hard, and I get this tremendous pushback from a small group of members of the community. I'm going to leave the university open, which one it was, right? And then you go into an elevator and somebody comes over and says like, I think you did a great job, right? I didn't want to talk about it publicly. Why not? Okay, so I think what we have right now is we have now an experience where both sides are in the game and they're vocal about it. But in most cases, that's not true. And I understand, this is my job. This is our job. This is what the board put us there to take the heat and to enforce the principles, to live by them. But boy, would it be helpful is to some faculty to publicly say, great that the president is supporting these principles that we all hold so dear.
So we need heterodox communities on all the campuses. If the professors stand up and support you, it makes it a lot easier.
Support the principals. That was a good job.
I just want to, look, of course, we all want sympathy, as presidents, because, it is pretty rough. Not pretty rough. It's very rough. But, look, I think in the end, as Daniel was just saying, these are jobs of service and love to the purposes of a university and to its function in society and a vision of what they are and so on. So they're great privileges also. And I think, at least from everything Daniel said is absolutely true. I think at this point we're counting 60,000 emails roughly in my inbox about these matters just since, I don't know, March something. There's an onslaught, and there are people who run campaigns, and there are people who say very, very bad things about you, and there are people who actually go way past that. And, I think we know that from what the public life is like these days, that people can get to very edgy places where they appear to be really threats. So there are lots of those things go on. But, what I want to come back to is what makes a place resilient? And how do you get to that? And so, I want to say during this period, at least inside our university, we've had, I think a very healthy engagement of the board, knowing where it's supposed to be and where it's not, but being thoughtful and really helping. We've had engagement with lots of faculty groups. We've had engagement with students and with alumni and friends. And I think in the end, a resilient university to all these onslaughts will be one where a lot of care over time is giving to building up those kinds of scaffoldings that make a community stronger. And so, what you do in a crisis does matter a lot. But, going back to where we started, what you do all the time is really important. You'll be okay in a crisis, no matter how much people say bad things about you, if all that other work has gone well. And so we tend to undervalue that other work, but that's where it's really at, at some level.
I would just say there, as with most things, there's no one set of answers. There are many. Obviously, having a strong board, because you lose your board support, you're gone, right? It's being able to find ways of dealing with sometimes what I call those blindfold cigarette moments where you step in a room and everyone wants to slice your head off, by smiling and shaking your head and taking it all on and posing some questions back.
You're the lightning rod.
What would you do? Okay, everyone in this room, you've got to decide what to do with the encampments, a few weeks ago. What would you do? And just to, again, be an educator. But there's one more thing that I'll say about this that all of you can help with. Some of you will be on presidential search committees or search committees for deans. And there's usually one question those search committees never ask. I've never been asked the question. And the only time it's come up is when they ask me, what question have we not asked you? And I say, okay, you're thinking about leadership in all the positive things. Yes, very important. We need to move an institution forward. We need to attract financial, reputational, human resources, run a virtuous cycle of impact. Yes. But how do you respond to a crisis? And tell me about a crisis to which you've responded. Because this becomes an art and science of itself in leadership. And the more we go through, the stronger we get. So I agree with you. I've had those experiences too. Like, why didn't you speak up? But now I'm used to it. I don't care. Because I know what that dynamic is. And so as long as my complete larynx is not ripped out of my throat, and I can get a couple of questions off to someone to think about things a little differently, I'm good. I'm good. And I don't ever collapse into, oh, it must be so hard to be a college president today. Well, then don't do it. I mean, we all feel rewarded. Yeah, incredibly stressed, frustrated, aggravated, but incredibly, profoundly rewarded by the privileged role that we have to lead at this moment in this way. For all of us, this is core to who we are, not just what we do. And we have to encourage and cultivate that inner inflection in alignment with our public role in each of our colleagues and get them around these tables to find out what they're experiencing in their context, not ours, in their context, to empower them individually and as a group.
I want to
is there any, so there's like literally 60 or 90 seconds left, but I do want to invite brief closing comments to express anything you haven't had a chance to say and want to still express. So please, Daniel.
Okay, so I just want to come back to your, which I think is spot on. I think so. I think the sense that there is this whining about like being a college president today, and my and I've said this in in the New York Times. I'm like in response to things publicly, but this is a really critical moment for higher education, and I look at this as a privilege. It's that being now having the opportunity to have an impact on that, and so I said a little bit tongue in cheek, but not so much. I said, if you want to be Prime Minister of Britain, you want to be it in 43, not 53, because that's when it matters. And so I think this is like as challenging as this is, and there are these moments when you have to deal with all these challenges. It's a hugely important moment, and I think I think we talked about this a bunch. We all recognize this, but it's really important that faculty recognize this too. This is a moment, this is a critical moment to stand up and be counted. And it's very important. We do not let that slip by.
Indeed, a critical moment. And any quick closing thoughts?
Well, I would say ditto to what my colleagues have all said here. I feel very proud of what we're doing, and I think it is making a difference, and we are being tested. And if we lose our jobs at some point, we don't actually need them, but we want to as long as we feel like we can continue to make a difference. It's very important to have your board to back you, which I also feel very, very privileged to have strong backing from the board. And the nicest thing a board member said to me recently was, "You're doing a great job in all this fire that's coming at you. I would have soiled a new pair of underwear," is what they said.
I want to say that I think it's really important, not just for this set of challenges, but for learning nationally, that we actually face the big forces. And one of the many challenges, even in this discussion, is we focused mainly on speech and mainly on cognitive processes. And I just want to point out how much we've lost sight of the full person. I have a report card. I want to just read you the first introductory paragraph. It's from a report card, June 2nd, 1933. Young man, sixth grader by the name of Ray Dewey in Lane County, Oregon. I just want to read this report card to you for my closing comment. The report card's to parents, and it says, "We give two separate reports. The first indicates the progress made by the pupil in the formation of the essential traits of character and attitudes of mind that make for good citizenship. Upon these depend the future of democracy and the stability of government. In this training, we recognize that the school shares responsibility with the home." And then it says, just with one simple sentence, "The second report indicates the progress in the regular study." And I read that in DC at a workshop that with the Citizens and Scholars Institute, a collective of, at the time, 26 presidents. Jack DeGoya was hosting it. And Jack said, president of Georgetown said, "Boy, we've got that flipped." Thanks, everybody.
Anything before we close?
Just one last comment. What's at stake here is the possibility of creating new knowledge that benefits humanity. I mean, that's really, if we're not truth seekers, we're not able to find that and do it. So a lot's at stake. And so I think, what you see here is a group of people who are very dedicated to that because a lot's at stake and it really matters. And there's a lot of wonderful things that people still don't know about the world. And we have to foster those environments where that happens.
You're here.
Okay.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation.